Welcome to the next video lecture. In this one, we're going to be covering casting. And casting is a term in programming that means you're taking something from one data type and transferring it into another data type. And an example of this is going to be if I make a variable here, I'll call it number. I'll set it equal to, put a string here, I'll say 10, just like that. And this right here, let me make this bigger so it's easier to see. This is not a number that our computer can do math on yet. This is read as plain text, like a sentence. We call them strings. And if I were to change this to the number 10, it's essentially saying the same thing here because we can't do math on TEN either. But I'll keep this as 10 for now. And so casting is when we transfer this into another number. We'll just say number 2. Casting is when we take it from this form here and we transfer it into a number that we can do math on. So I might say 10 as an integer. And there's also another data type because we have strings here. I'll put it to the side here. This is a string type. This is a integer. And another one that we have available to us is a float, and that is like this. And in Java, it could also be known as a double, but we'll call it a float here. I believe float's a more universal way of describing this data type. A float is a decimal point number. I put a 0.0 here. It's the same thing as this number numerically in math, but in computer programming, this number is seen as a different type than this number here. And to make that a little bit more clear, if I put 10.1, this is definitely a float, and this cannot be represented by an integer because integers are the numbers like -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, and etc. in both directions. Then floats are just all real numbers, all the decimal point numbers, including pi, e, and any other irrational number that exists. Okay, so converting between these, example of converting, if I want to take line 1 variable, which is number, as a string, and I want to do math on this, I can use this function here called int. And this int function is going to take in a string as input, and it's going to try to convert that into an integer, as in going from this data type to this data type here. And so I'll put a 10 in here. I'll set this equal to a variable here called converted. Save this. And I'm going to print out converted. I'm going to add 1 to it just to show I can do math on it now. And I'll come up here and I'll print out converted, and we'll see what this does in just a second. Actually, not converted. I'll just say number. But I'm just going to put this in comments for now. We're not going to use it. So on line 8, we've created a variable called converted, and we're setting it equal to the string 10 casted into an integer, which means transformed into an integer. And we're going to print that out +1, so we should get 11. And jump over here. And we'll run Python casting. There's 11. If I come back over here, I uncomment this line right here, this is going to throw an error because it's trying to add 1 to a string, and our computer doesn't see this as a number that can have math done to it. It just sees it as plain text, as a sentence or a word essentially. So if I run this, I should get some kind of value error, type error, okay. And it says on line 7, can only concatenate string, not int to string. And so we've got some new terminology here, this concatenate terminology. What that's saying is, you're asking me to add something onto the end of this word, but you gave me a number and not another letter or word. So this is what it's trying to do. What it's trying to do, I'll go ahead and put a print statement here. And I'll say dogs like, I'm going to put a plus here. And then I'm going to say chew toys. Now we have a string data type here. We have a plus sign. We have another string data type here. And this is what it's trying to do when it says concatenate. Concatenating means we're taking one string and we're adding it with another string, making one larger string. Basically this sentence here from these two sentence parts. If I run this, dogs like chew toys, and it printed out 11 because I forgot to uncomment this out here. It says dogs like chew toys because it smashed these together into one value and printed it out, otherwise known as concatenating it. So that's what was trying to happen here on line 7 on this earlier iteration of our code. But we gave it an int data type. And in programming, adding data types that are different or operating between two data types just doesn't work. So we have to cast them. So on line 9 over here, which was my old line 7 that had the error, I can actually surround this variable number that was a string with this int casting function, and then I can run this again and it should print out a value. Prints out 11 because it takes in this 10 as a string, this integer function outputs it as 10 as an integer, so now it's this kind of 10, and then it adds 1 to it to get 11, and then it prints it out. And that's how you can cast from a string to an integer. Okay, but that's not the only way that we can cast objects or data types in Python. We've just seen casting from a string to an integer. We can also go the other way around. We can start with an integer and cast that into a string. And so I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this for now. And let's say I want to print out a sentence, and I'll say there are, say, amount of dogs. Normally I could do this by just putting number here, and then another part of the sentence, and this would be all well and good. So I'll run it. There are 10, I'm going to change the grammar of that actually. I'll just say dogs here to make this sound better. It says there are 10 dogs. But if I had a number here, not a string, let's say that I did some kind of calculation. We had some kind of inventory or some kind of like program that had a database of all the dogs that were at a vet clinic at any given time. And it calculates that based off the amount of records, so it counts them, and it's counting up an integer. Let's say that there's 10, and we want to print that out. So we would normally put that variable there, which is number 2. But this is going to give us the error that we saw earlier about concatenating a string. And let me clear this out and run it again. Yeah, can only concatenate string, not integer, because we're trying to tell it, make a sentence out of a number. And it can't just do that on its own. We have to tell it to do that. So to cast from an integer to a string, we'll use this str function, which is to say, whatever data type I've been given, turn this into a string. And so we'll jump back and we'll run it. Now it works, says there are 10 dogs. And I can do the same thing with my float value here. And having 10.1 dogs doesn't really make sense. I'll leave that as 10.0. And I'll change this to number 3. So we have the variable in there. Now this is going to take this float value and convert this into a string. So it should say 10.0 dogs this time. There are 10.0 dogs because we cast it from float to string. If I didn't put this str function here, I'll remove it just so we can see the error. It should give the same error about not being able to concatenate with a number type or a float type. Yeah, cannot do that. And so you can convert from integers and floats into strings using this str function. So I'll put a note here. Convert to int. We'll use the int function. And then to convert to string, use the str function. And then finally, to convert into a floating point number to a decimal number, we put convert. To do that, we put float, just like that. And so I'll take this number 2 here. I'm going to chain these together. I'm going to say convert that to a float, but then make it a string, because we could put these inside of each other. So I'll put str, open parenthesis, close parenthesis, save it. This will convert our integer into a float to give it that decimal point number, and then it'll convert it into a string so we can print it out inside this message here. There it is. There are 10.0 dogs. So we did the whole conversion. Something important also, in our integer casting function or conversion function, I mentioned earlier that it takes in a string data type, but it also takes in float data types, and will convert from a float to an integer. The way it does this is you might expect it to round it, but let's just see what it does instead. I'm going to print out, we'll just print out the number. So we'll say number, actually int number 3. So we're taking in a float value here. I'm going to change this to 10.7, and then it prints it out as an integer instead. So there should not be this decimal number here. And it's important to recognize how this is implemented, because it can change some very important things if you make like a calculator program or anything that does a lot of calculations. If you convert from float to an integer, you have to be very careful, and I'll show you why in just a second. Looks like, oh, I misspelled it. It has a capital N. Case sensitive. Okay, so it prints out 10. Notice that our number is 10.7 for this variable number 3. In math, we would round this up to 11 if we were to transfer it into an integer. But in Python, it doesn't round it. Instead, it just slices it off. It just cuts it off, which is called truncating it. And so it just gets rid of it and forgets the decimal and puts the values here. And that's what I meant by very important, because if you have a program that is doing very precise calculations, and then you want to round that program, you can't just do the straight conversion, because you'll lose your decimal values that you need. And so this is all the casting functions that you can use to convert between strings, integers, and floats. And you can just input any data type into these, and it will attempt to cast that. But there are problems sometimes. If I give invalid input into the int function or the float function, input that doesn't make sense, it's going to throw an error. And I'll show you an example of what that is. If I say print and transfer something into an integer, looks like we're taking number 3 here. Let's make it the string up here. This number is equal to 10. So this will work as it is now, but if I change this to words, and I ask it to convert a word into a number, this is not going to work. I'll show you what will happen. We get a value error. Invalid literal for int with base 10. What this means is you've put the invalid input into this function. This function cannot do anything with a word. It has to have a number. And so in our next lesson, we're going to get into how to fix this. But for now, this is casting in Python, and you can play around with this and maybe try to implement into your dialog tree somehow. But for now, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.